Now, I just love to paint plein air, but rarely do I get a session painting outside where I get to finish the painting. So in this little video, we're going to be taking an en plein air study, a seascape, bringing that back into the studio to finish off with some cool detail techniques. Roll that intro. I hope this video finds you well. My name's Andrew, and if you're new here, this is a channel where I talk about all things to do with painting. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, consider subscribing. Now, a little while ago, I brought out a video of painting en plein air in a rural setting, looking at some beautiful mountains with some cows in the foreground, and I got quite a response to that video. So I thought I'd produce another one here for you, but this time showing you a different scenario of painting by the seaside. And this was a fantastic location in an area called Taupo Bay, way up in the far north of the North Island of New Zealand. Let's check it out. I first saw this scene back in 2011, and ever since then, I really wanted to paint it. It is a stunning, epic coastline here, and the colors are really spectacular. On a bright and sunny day, those colors in the water just sing. And I love the contrast between the ocean and these really sharp, rocky forms. The situation is perfect for this beautiful, tranquil, sunny beach painting. Of course, not every en plein air situation works out this way. The weather in New Zealand, particularly along the coastline, can be quite unpredictable, but we can't let that stop us. And so I figured I better make an en plein air study in whatever conditions I was presented with. Now, I've traveled up here and I'm only here for a couple of days, so I thought I might get a couple of paintings out. And either way, whatever study I produce might inform a bigger painting back in the studio. To me, there's no such thing as a failure when you're painting out in the field. You'll always come away learning something. Even though this is a gray and dismal scene, luckily the next day we had a bit of light, and so it allowed all of those colors to really resonate. I've set up my easel box right alongside this little creek. I love the linear aspect to the creek that points directly at that cliff, which I want to be my main focal point. This has also allowed the opportunity for some really nice reflections in the foreground. So I begin to sketch up my scene with a mixture of burnt umber and quinacridone magenta, and then I begin working with whatever's furthest away and bring those tiers of depth forward. Now, I often work in this manner when painting en plein air. However, sometimes it's important, in a sunny situation in particular, to anchor the light. So before too long, I need to make sure I get some darks in there to just figure out and really secure where the shadows are going. I'm also striving for some sense of depth. So again, in this painting, like with a lot of my other demos, I'm going to be getting more tonally varied and more saturated the further I bring subjects forward towards the viewer. The light is changing really quickly. If the slightest amount of shadow passes from overhead clouds, then this can really drastically change the color dynamic throughout the painting. So time's of the essence. I've got to move fast. I'm applying some very simple marks in a tile-like fashion. I continually reload my brush so that each brushstroke is effective. I don't try to go too far with the brush loaded with paint and then have this paint overextend itself and just form this scumbly, smudgy mess on the canvas. Rather, I continually replenish the supply of paint on the end of the brush and lay down some effective marks. This actually helps me move a lot faster. It also helps working on a smaller 8x10 panel. Bigger paintings naturally take much longer to produce. Now, as I bring the depth forward, what I'm starting to do, as I mentioned earlier, is darkening the shadows as well as increasing the saturation. Yellow is a color that is critical when painting en plein air. We must consider our yellows. Notice how that distant cliff, or the cliff that's kind of in that mid-ground beyond this foreground slope covered with greenery, the yellows in the green there are far less intense. This aids that sense of depth that we're able to achieve in a painting. Especially when we're shooting from the hip in an en plein air situation like this, we need to have a few little tricks up our sleeves to make sure that we have some indication of a three-dimensional space. Now, there's not much three-dimensional space that I'm seeing in the cliffs ahead of me, so I'm using a little bit of artistic license here and pushing that depth dynamic a little bit further than what I'm actually seeing in reality. Now stick with me here, because when I bring this painting back into the studio, I'm going to give you a detailed explanation into all of the colors that I'm using. Now, one of the last things that I add are these foreground elements, in particular that water snaking its way towards me, and then again leading off towards the main subject. I'm focused on two aspects here, the reflection of the sky, and then the absence of the reflection of the sky, which allows some of that underlying color in the water to show through. And this is a slightly more saturated and darkened value from what we get in the sunlit sand. One of my favorite brushes to use for painting out in the field is this ivory dagger with a short handle made by Rosemary & Co. And in fact, all the brushes that I'm using in this demo are from Rosemary & Co. And if you'd like to check those out, the link is in the description down below. Now, you may have noticed through this demonstration that I've been working in zones. I've compartmentalized the composition into various areas, and I'm simply going from one zone to another to another. And once the whole painting is covered with major blocks of color, then I can go back and add some extra details. And I'd consider this white water here, applied with a small flat brush, to be one of those details. This allows me to crisp up the image towards the end of the process. And within about 2 hours, my study is done, and I have something to go back over the top of back in the studio. Sometimes I'll leave an en plein air study as a painting in its own right, but sometimes I do like to add just a little more detail. Now, I had a couple of shots at painting this painting, as you saw, on location, but I was really particularly happy with the sunny version of this landscape. So I thought this is the one that I really want to focus on and bring that up to a really beautifully detailed little studio painting, working directly over the top of the en plein air study. Let's get stuck into it. Now, before attempting to work back over the top of any painting, I like to make sure that underlying layer is dry. Normally, if I'm using Liquid Original as my medium, this will dry in about 24 hours. I'm using the exact same palette of Blue Ridge oils that I was using out in the field. So here we have burnt umber, transparent yellow oxide, a mixture of lead white and titanium white, cadmium yellow light, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, and cobalt teal. As always, you can find links to the materials that I use in the description down below. Now we're going to begin to work here in the exact same fashion as we produced that en plein air study, starting with whatever's furthest away and working our way forward. Now I do this for a couple of reasons, and you can see the combinations of colors that I'm mixing there on the palette. The combinations at this stage are incredibly simple. We're only using white, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, and burnt umber primarily. Now I'm going to add just the smallest amount of cadmium yellow and a little bit of that transparent yellow oxide to warm up the sky a little bit, but this must be used sparingly. If we get out too much of the cadmium, we're going to get a green sky and some garish yellow clouds. Just a small touch will do. Now I use this opportunity working back over the top of a dried en plein air study to create some interesting texture across the surface. This dagger brush, a Tisch dagger short handle here for the en plein air set, this one here actually provides some really nice cloud texture when we hold it just so against the canvas and just lightly brush across the top. There's actually distance and separation from tiny individual marks laid down by the brush, which allows some of that underlying color to come through. So I'm focused on slight contrasts and changes between the tone and the color of whatever I'm working over the top of. I'm not just trying to paint out the whole thing, rather add to it. I want to retain some of that painterly quality that I achieved in the original study, so I'm not going to completely lose that throughout this process, but at the same time, I want to make sure I resolve the image a little more. So now I'm beginning to work a little bit closer now towards the viewer into this distant cliff. And I'm adding to the shadow color here with some deeper colors of ultramarine blue, quinacridone magenta, and burnt umber. Now for some of that sunlight and warmth that is showing across that cliff with some of the illuminated vegetation, I'm going to start to add some transparent yellow oxide, burnt umber, and cadmium yellow light, and apply this to some of the areas where the sun's hitting the rock, but also that vegetation. Now again, if I get too much yellow out, it's going to completely destroy the depth that I'm trying to achieve. Yellow is a color that doesn't travel well over vast distances. So if we reserve that for the immediate foreground or whatever's closer to us, we can achieve a bit of that illusion of depth. Now, one of my favorite brushes for detailing an en plein air study is a 1/4 inch Tisch dagger brush. This is something that just lays down really nice marks, especially as the brush starts to get a little bit older and the individual fibers splay out a little bit more. What this does is creates a chattered effect and a nice random assortment of marks. And if we load the brush along the lead edge of the dagger, we can lay down quite a sharp accumulation of paint. But the randomness is what lends itself towards an indication or impression of rock highlights and vegetation highlights. So as I previously mentioned, as I bring the depth forward, I'm going to need to get darker in the shadows and more saturated with my colors. And now I'm going to start to add more and more of that yellow. And also, it's going to add to the warmth, thus bringing this cliff a little further forward. It's all about these subtle manipulations of color and tone. This is what creates that illusion. Now compare the shadow of the rock in the bottom right-hand side with some of those shadows in the distant cliff. There's quite a contrast between those two tones, and this is what is adding to that sense of three-dimensional space. Now, of course, I've sped up the process of this painting here considerably. This would have been on my easel for a day or so, probably about 12 hours in this painting in the second sitting. So I make a few marks, I get up out of the stool away from the easel, and I view this thing from a distance to make sure it's working. It's always good to get some distance between you and the painting, and that way you can see if you're on the right track. Because I'm holding back with my tones, there's always somewhere to go. I can always continually increase the depth of shadows or the height of those highlights. So here what I'm doing is I'm making a nice dark shadow reserved for this foreground rock. And this here is pretty far from black, but it's mainly a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And I'm going to apply it with this synthetic round brush. Now I'm leaving some spaces between my marks for highlights to go as I carry on with this rock. And I noticed on the day that I was there, this is actually a mass of multiple rocks as part of some sort of volcanic process. But it has created a really interesting form for the foreground of the beach. Now for this process, in particular adding minute details, it helps to have a steady hand. A couple of things that I can recommend for you if you want to attempt some detail like this is using a dental assistance chair. This actually comes with an elbow support. It's probably worth Googling that and have a look at some of the images that come up. So I've got this arm that supports my elbow. It swings around from the back of the chair, and this really helps with any detail. It's also important to have a maul stick, and you'll see me use that later on in the process. This is something that comes out that you rest on the easel that supports your wrist so you can apply those finer marks. I felt the distant ocean here needed a little bit more color coming through, and then this would bleed into that breaking wave, which I wanted to make sure was featured in this painting. And this is pretty much straight cobalt teal. A touch of cadmium yellow was added and a bit of titanium white to lighten it up. I'm using a 1/4 inch ivory dagger here to apply some of the white water of that breaking wave coming up onto the shore. This is allowing me to sharpen up that shoreline, but I don't want to go too far with the whitewater just yet. I want to make sure I reserve some of these marks for the very end. So it's time to move on to that beach. And here what I'm trying to do is mix up plenty of paint and apply some more interesting brush strokes to break up this area. Now, a big zone like the beach in this seascape could form a monotonous mass, so I want to have some interest in here as well. So I change the colors slightly and I add to the contrast in some of those tones, as well as emphasize those converging lines into the distance. Now, as this water meanders and cuts its way through the sand, it leaves these sharp and jagged edges. These cast some really well-defined shadows. I go back in and apply these with a pointed round. I'm not going to the depth of the tone that I used in that foreground rock, it's just slightly lighter than that. But it allows for that sharpness to come through, and it really defines the edge of this water. I use a thin, translucent mix of oil paint here for the darker area in the water. This is where the absence of that sky reflection is going, allowing for the illusion of the cliff reflection to come through. What's happening here, though, is more of that color that's underneath the surface of the water, the sand below the water body, that is actually reflecting a bit more of its light back towards us as the viewer. So it's showing up slightly warmer and slightly yellower. Over the top of this, I'm going to add some finer marks with that sky reflection color, and this helps the water lay down as a flat plane. Now it's time for those final detail marks, and I always leave detail to the end of the process. I'm applying some of this white water with a pointed synthetic round, and I'm reloading my brush regularly to apply a physical deposit of paint. I want some thickness to that white water so that it picks up light and reflects this back towards the viewer. In a similar fashion, I revise some of the marks in this cliff wall here and add to the brilliance of these sun highlights off the tops of the vegetation. A bit more yellow here will allow this to come further forward. Also, I thought it might use a few rocky highlights, and that would allow this to come forward even further. Now, every part of this painting has been covered from that initial en plein air sitting. Hopefully it still retained a bit of that painterly quality, and I'm pretty happy with the end result. This will probably make its way into a frame and head straight to the gallery.
Well, I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, then make sure you click that like button for me and leave me a comment down below. As always, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and click the notification icon so you're notified when I upload another video. You can find me on social media. Those links are in the description down below. But most important, make sure you're subscribed through my website at andrewtischler.com. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I'll see you again soon.